Good. It's good to see you here. Thank you for coming to Democracy Days. One of my favorite times of year. I always talk about how much I enjoy doing it. I've done it just about every year, barring great personal injury, since I started. So are we in the 21st year, Michael?
22nd.
22nd year of Democracy Days, which is pretty exciting. There is a list of other presentations that are going on besides just these ones, and all the ones that were yesterday. Most of them were recorded and are streaming on the website, so please be sure to check those out if you weren't able to make them. I know a lot of teachers sometimes give extra credit, like I do, if you watch those and write a reflection on them. So check with your teachers, or just check them out for the heck of it, because it's really interesting information that we are doing here. So I'm Grace Moser, and I'm just going to start us off and then introduce the other panelists to you and let them talk, and we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. I am a history teacher here at St. Charles Community College, and I've become aware of some of the banned books because many of them have historical content to them. So I'll probably be discussing more of that aspect with you guys today. I just realized I forgot my notes. Let me grab them. Also on the panel is Rachel McWhorter, our English faculty, Corey Porter, English faculty, and Michael Kelker, founder of Democracy Days, and also English faculty. So all of them are going to be coming from their various disciplines, talking about books that have been banned and sort of like the history behind it, and the types of content that these books are delivering. And it's going to be really interesting, specifically ask these people because they're all working in fields that have been specifically targeted and banned by these larger pushbacks against banned books. So if you've been paying attention lately to the news, you may have heard something about the latest book bans happening in our country. And I just wanted to, if you haven't, it's okay, you're going to learn about it today. And it was raised with me with another faculty member that, was a really good opportunity to talk about why these books are being banned and what type of content they're objecting to. And it is really surprising, I think, the content that people are getting up in arms about. So before we get into any of this, I have a short video for you guys to watch. This sort of lays the foundation for the book bannings. And Nick, are we okay with this?
Turning it into the top firm in Chicago.
It's making me watch the ad again.
Since last summer, parents, school boards, and thirsty political groups have pulled off over 1,500 book bans in schools across the U.S. That's more bans than in 2018, 2019, and 2020 combined. But hey, at least we've moved past actually burning books.
Mom, let me throw some.
Okay, maybe not. Moving on. Actual book bans have taken hold in districts in over half the states and hit more than 1,000 different titles. Some books have been removed in many districts. Others got targeted in only one. The titles range from books that only a few advanced readers might be interested in to picture books about making tamales at Christmas. But because sometimes people do think some books are too racy or I guess too spooky, the American Library Association has recommendations for how someone can submit a questionable book to be reviewed and possibly removed. This process usually involves the government's #1 fetish, paperwork, which is supposed to make sure the people trying to pull books have, read those books. But those protocols aren't being followed. Only 4% of reported bans since last summer followed a formal process. Most were handed down by school administrators or board members, often looking to appease screaming adults.
This is pornography, plain and simple, and it does not belong in our schools.
In one district in Pennsylvania, people complained about books and the board banned 441 titles, including a picture book about Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor and a book about black women in STEM. And in Texas, a parent helped ban a book using pretty intimate confessions.
I do not want my children to learn about anal sex in middle school. I have never had anal sex. I don't want to have anal sex. I don't want my kids having anal sex.
These bans aren't just a random attack on the threat of full bookshelves. Many of the banned books have main characters who are people of color. About a quarter directly address race or racism. A little more than that deal with themes related to being LGBTQ. Whenever there is a time of social progress, people tend to fight back by trying to control information. The Confederacy did that with Uncle Tom's Cabin, and more recently in the 80s, Jerry Falwell and his evangelical masses went after a few of the classics because of what they called obscenity. But some of these new bans are backed up with new laws that can come with harsh penalties.
17 states now restrict teaching race in classrooms, especially in ways that make students feel discomfort, anguish, or guilt. Similar bans have been introduced in at least 25 other states.
The Florida bill that limits talking about gender or sexuality in schools is being used as a model in at least a dozen other places. Teachers who don't follow some of these laws can lose their jobs. Schools that violate the discomfort law in Tennessee can have up to $5 million of funding withheld. Conservative politicians and advocacy groups are playing off that fear by releasing lists of hundreds of books that they think should be forbidden. So even if they're not formally banned, schools are taking these books off the shelves to avoid the fight. Like a district in Florida, where a conservative group released something called the 2021 Porn Report, which is not a breakdown of all the things you looked up on incognito mode. Instead, it's just a list of kids' books they found icky. It includes the book Everywhere Babies, which is about babies, but here's the twist, they're everywhere.
There wasn't an explanation for why it was on a porn list, but the author said it's because of this picture.
I will say, if you think two men putting their arms around each other is pornographic, do not watch men's team sports. It gets obscene. Americans don't agree on much, but almost all of them think books should not be banned. These edicts are coming because of the loudest groups of conservative parents and the politicians who have figured out they can get an advantage at the polls by riling those parents up.
We watched parents so upset because there was such sexually explicit material in the library.
Some calling for the immediate removal of this very pornographic material from our libraries and our schools.
Do you agree with this book that is being taught with kids that babies are racist?
It's hard to know if bans actually keep books out of kids' hands. A group in Texas has an underground library to caravan banned books to students who can't get them. And places like the Brooklyn Public Library are offering free memberships to U.S. teenagers anywhere, so they can access whatever books they want. And then there's the whole internet. But what is clear is that the people most impacted are already the students. Students who are being robbed of places and ways to ask questions and get information, who are being told that something about themselves is wrong or pornographic, or that their lived experiences has never been and never will be part of the American story.
So I liked that video because it talked about sort of the trends that are happening. I mean, this has really picked up in the last year or so. And just so you know, Missouri has passed a law that bans sexually explicit content, but it's really only restricted to images and graphic novels, which I'm sure Corey's probably going to talk about at some point, maybe? Yes, okay, so I won't talk too much about that. But I think one of the most troubling things about this that's different from different book bans is that this has spread beyond curriculum, which is what Jerry Falwell's and the conservative Christian right in the 80s was kind of targeting, like making it so that teachers couldn't teach it. It's now expanded to school libraries, classroom libraries, and public libraries. So these laws are now targeting public librarians, making them responsible for fines if they're found distributing these books, and penalties up to a year in prison for potentially distributing these books. And that's in Missouri. So that's putting academics and teachers and librarians in this really bad situation where it's making them afraid to potentially provide these books to everybody or being caught providing these books to everybody. So we're going to talk more about this whole issue of book bans and sort of why these books are being targeted, because I think that's what's really confusing. As you can tell in the Vice video, they talked about a children's book being labeled pornographic because it showed a man with his arm around another man. And what we can do to push back against it. So I always love Democracy Days because we raise awareness, but I think it's really important to know what you can do in response. So I want to take time to do that with you guys today. One other story that I just wanted to share with you is that This is, of course, not a new idea in America. We've seen different iterations of this. This is our current moral panic, which is a term I wanted to define with you guys today. So a moral panic is defined as a public mass movement based on false or exaggerated perceptions or information that exceeds the actual threat society is facing. Moral panic is widespread fear and often an irrational threat to society's values, interests, and safety. So we see moral panics very commonly in American history as a result of another term I want to talk to you is sort of our culture wars. So who gets to who gets to decide what defines our culture? So a culture war is a conflict or struggle for dominance between groups within a society or between societies, arising from their differing beliefs, practices, etc. I believe as a historian that what we're seeing is backlash to a changing America, a more tolerant America, an America that is no longer white majority, white middle-class majority, white Protestant majority. And we're seeing profound shifts in our populations of being more interracial, of being exposed to religions other than Christianity. And we're seeing pushback over this. And in some cases, we see these pushbacks happen when a culture war is successful, when one side is winning more than the others. So in recent light with more acceptance as far as like Black Lives Matter being such a influential movement within the country, with more people identifying and accepting that what happened to George Floyd was wrong, with society being more tolerant and backing away from conservative Christianity as a main religion and influence in the United States, and then with the acceptance of LGBTQ rights, with the acceptance of and the protection of gay marriage within the United States. I think what we're seeing now is pushbacks to those ideas of people feeling very scared that their way of life is going to disappear and that their values and their concerns are no longer going to be the dominant values in our country, which I would argue is probably a good thing, but that's my opinion. So I wanted to give the other faculty here a chance to sort of talk about how this issue affects their discipline and what they've seen come up with it. I will share one last story with you. I actually got a chance to attend a webinar with Art Spiegelman, who is the author of Maus, and I'm sure Corey's going to be talking about Maus. It's a graphic novel that tells the story of the Holocaust through metaphors and animals being symbols of different ethnic groups. So in the novel, the Jews are depicted as mice and the Nazis are depicted as cats. And it seems like a really weird thing to want to censor, to want to ban. Like, don't you want kids to learn about the Holocaust? Isn't this something, like, first of all, it's not made for kids, even though it has animals in it. It's definitely an adult book. But what was interesting to me was what the Tennessee school board, or parents who objected to the school board, what part of the book they objected to. It wasn't the depictions of the Holocaust. It wasn't the violence that it depicted. That they were okay with. What they were opposed to was this scene where it showed Art Spiegelman's mother having committed suicide. And he depicted a picture in the book of a woman who was naked in a bathtub having ended her life. And that was the picture that the parents objected to, calling it too sexual for kids. And what I was struck with was when Art Spiegelman was talking, he said that was probably most upsetting to him because there was nothing sexual about that picture. It was showing the trauma of having lost his mother, who was a Holocaust survivor, having ended her life due to the trauma that she herself had experienced in the Holocaust. And the fact that they had sexualized that image and said that it was lewd, right, was like even another layer on like painful for him, because they completely skipped over the trauma of his personal experience of losing his mother. Then they just reduced her form to something that was sexual, just completely missing everything, the whole point about it. So I wanted to share that story with you because I think that gives like a really good example of how limited and obscure these criticisms are often for these books being banned. Right, for like, you know, the children's books showing men embracing. Like, it's so specific and seemingly innocent, the types of things that they're taking issue with. But I think we should be paying attention to it. So after that, I will turn it over to, I think Corey's going to go first, so I'll hand it over to him. I'm going to sit up here because my dog is being good. This is my dog, Athos, by the way, my service dog.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out this morning. There's so many places to begin with this. But Grace opened up with this idea of moral panics. And moral panics aren't new to the 21st century, to America even. Got a quote going back to, it's attributed to Plato, 400 BCE. Now early life is very impressible, and children ought not to learn what they will have to unlearn when they grow up. We must therefore have censorship of nursery tales, banishing some and keeping others. Some of them are very improper. Shall our youth be encouraged to beat their fathers by the example of Zeus? The young are incapable of understanding allegory. This idea, when transferred to the 20th century, is in my mind, I teach comic books, most prominently identified through Dr. Frederick Wertham's book in 1954, Seduction of the Innocent. In this book, Dr. Wertham essentially argues that comic books as a medium are rotting the minds of America's youth. There was a subcommittee that was formed. Dr. Wertham was introduced or asked to speak, and the Comic Book Publishers of America saw the writing on the wall. EC Comics, originally published or originally run by Max Gaines, stopped publishing comics such as Tales from the Crypt, Haunt of Fear, crime and suspense stories, things that were purported to drive children to violence. So in response to these growing concerns, the publishers started the CCA, the Comics Code Authority, and started regulating themselves. Wertham's work suggests that comics had a number of detrimental effects on young people as well. The CCA finally disbanded in 2011. The last stamp, I believe, was on Archie Comics, but it had lost its teeth many years before. This idea that really was put forth in the 20th century was concerned with violence. The idea that children would follow in the footsteps of those that they were seeing. They would become murderers based on what they were reading. What's mainly different with today's bans, what we saw in the video, what we've really seen in everything in these past 2 years or past 3 years has been a focus on pornography, on sexuality. In fact, televangelist Jimmy Swaggart once said that rock and roll was the new pornography. And to take this back to the idea of moral panics, whether or not it's nursery tales, comic books, sexuality, whatever, this is nothing new. Throughout the 20th century, parents were concerned about radio, cars, rock and roll, rap, video games, Dungeons and Dragons, Pokemon. All these things seducing the innocence of youth. But this idea of pornography, it's you know it when you see it, right? And in fact, even contemporary critics of comic books, of children's literature that is supposedly pornographic, speak to this. Conservative activist Michelle Beavers says, "These books were easy to spot because they were graphic novels, but other books you actually have to read, and that's a problem. It takes work." What we see with quotes like this and the idea of a moral panic is that it's easy to label things other. It's easy to denounce them when you find them easy to see. But even in the video, when we see an image of two men sharing an embrace, there's nothing about this that's inherently pornographic or even easy to label as pornographic. Furthermore, because comics cannot be read aloud, they aren't easily supervised by grown-ups. Therefore, this visual aspect of the medium is what many critics hone in on. If we were to expand this beyond just comic books, graphic novels, even to children's literature. It's tough to define what children even are or what books are meant for children. Children are a heterogeneous group. The notion of a child varies historically. Children vary by age, race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, region, and education. And maybe most importantly, children's books aren't written by children. Children's books represent adults' ideas of children. I think what's especially concerning to me about the wave of recent bans that we've seen in these few years. Again, the video showed you that bans in 2021, there have been more bans rather in 2021 in the past 3 years combined. What's especially concerning to me is that many of these bans are put forth as homegrown or grassroots initiatives. Parents speaking out at school board meetings, parents writing school boards or their legislatures. But in actuality, many of their complaints come from a script, or rather come from a list that was published in October 2021 by Matt Krause, a Republican of the Texas State Legislature. And this list, it's 15 pages of many books that I just scratched my head at, but what the parents have been doing, or what this coordinated effort is putting together, is parents searching for objectionable images, or more poignantly, objectionable words, using a Control F to find a word that they might disagree with or find taken out of context, and using that as a reason to ban the book. Some of these titles, for example, are medical ethics, moral and legal conflicts in healthcare, homosexuality, opposing viewpoints, human sexuality, opposing viewpoints, abortion, opposing viewpoints, or this one is one of my favorites, The Year They Burned the Books, published in 1999, on Krause's list of books that should be banned for objectionable material. Other books deal with teen pregnancy, birth control and predictions, problems of death, teen suicide. These are not pornographic materials. These are facets of every teenager's life, more so in the 21st century. This isn't an abstract national issue as well. It affects us more acutely, more locally. Maybe some of you have attended schools or school districts that themselves have adopted book bans recently. And in fact, Missouri Senate Bill 775 establishes guidelines related to providing, quote, explicit sexual materials to a student. This endangers teachers, librarians, administrators. But of course, no one is arguing that pornography should be provided to students, except for that Michelle Beavers, who says that, or rather Christine Gator, who says, the public library should not endorse children to read pornography, quote, without a parent's permission. The idea here is that these will affect what you have the ability to access, what your siblings will have the ability to access, even what your children will have the ability to access. And of course, explicit sexual materials is subjective. To label things pornography in order to ban them from schools is to deny students access to their curiosity. A big part of what we do in teaching English is developing critical thinking or intellectual curiosity. It's not often that we're able to get our students to engage with the text, or rather, it doesn't happen all the time. Many students seek out information on their own. By removing these books from school libraries, from classrooms, from public libraries, we deny students that avenue of inquiry. We're not offering them the ability to seek out ideas for themselves, and instead we're prescribing to them exactly what we think children should read and who children are. Going back to this idea of coordination too, most of these groups that have been organized in banning these books and in sending forth this list, Over 73% of them appear to have formed since 2021. Where was the outrage prior to this, if this is not manufactured? Perhaps that rhetorical question isn't very strong of an argument, but especially going back to the idea that moral panics have existed quite some time. In any case, some of the books, too, that have been banned that I've taught in the past, I want to introduce to you Fun Home by Alison Bechdel, a family tragic comic. This here is a graphic novel. It's a memoir about Alison Bechdel's exploration of her own sexuality, coming out as gay, and then re-examining her relationship with her father. This book has made many lists, including Wentzville's banned book list, but so too has Why Comics from Underground to Everywhere. This is an academic study explaining the value of comic books in the classroom, which it itself has been banned because it contains excerpts from these objectionable comics. And Grayson mentioned Mouse by Art Spiegelman, a book that I teach, but rather I'd like to leave to my colleague, Michael Kelker, because he's spent so much of his career studying the Holocaust and teaching Mouse concurrently. In fact, Michael helped me start to teach Mouse in the classroom as well. I feel like I'm kind of all over the place here. If anyone wants to jump in, that would be great.
You want me to?
Do you want to go ahead and
Yeah, because
Mouse would be great, I think.
sure. My limited remarks are kind of a case study of Mouse. And the critical thinking question that I would like to pose to all of you this morning is this: are there parallels, and if so, to what extent, between the concept of Gleichschaltung in Nazi Germany and recent American history? Gleichschaltung is a German word referring to the process of Nazification. So if you just look up the keyword term, process of Nazification, or the Nazification of German society, you will come to grips with this German word, Gleichschaltung, which is the campaign to align German society, especially arts and culture, with Nazi ideals. These ideals, of course, are founded on presumed Aryan racial superiority. I teach Holocaust literature and have for 20 years or so every spring. I'm also a parent, and Mouse was recently banned in McMinn County, Tennessee, for young people at the age of 13, 14, 15. I have a 13-year-old daughter, so I'm invested in this. This is not just merely an academic issue for me. I have a kid who has been introduced to some Holocaust education in her public school. And I was quite impressed, by the way, with how that unit plan was handled. So it's personal to me, too. And I'd like to focus on this question of to what extent is there this, I wouldn't say that American society is being Nazified along the lines of what we see in Germany 1930s, but I'm looking at history as a guide. Are there parallels? Does it offer some guidance, the past? And if we look at Art Spiegelman's Mouse, I'd like to ask for a hand count. How many of you have read Mouse? Raise your hands high, okay. Handful of you. How many of you have read a banned book? All right, quite a few of you. Typically, there's room for questions of the presenters and panelists, but I'd like to leave room for questions of you, the audience. I'd like to know what you have learned from your exposure to banned literature. So we will leave time so that you can tell us what you've learned. If you're not familiar with Mouse, it's been widely praised and read and integrated in school curricula since its publication in 1992. Mouse came out of Spiegelman's own experience growing up with parents who were survivors of the Holocaust, although the nature and the quality of their survival differed significantly between mother and father. And that's a huge part about what Mouse unveils. Notably, Spiegelman used the graphic novel as his medium for conveying the story of what was then considered a bold, even controversial idea, which was to represent the characters, Germans as cats, Jews as mice. Americans were depicted as dogs and Poles as pigs, and this was controversial at the time because Nazism was founded on this idea of a hierarchy of races, and that Jews were subhuman. And so Spiegelman caught a lot of flack initially before the work kind of settled in. Spiegelman caught a lot of flack for kind of reinscribing what was perceived as a bad thing to do, which was to depict Jews as mice, which was part of the Nazi propaganda literally in the 1930s. You'd see propaganda films where vermin and disease and disease associated with mice were then linked with Jews. But despite the surprising figuration, Maus was soon recognized as an important work revealing not only a portrait of Holocaust survivors, but the second generation experience, second generation being the sons and daughters of Holocaust survivors. Maus is one of the dozens of titles, hundreds of titles really, that have been subjected lately to bans. And I would argue to you that focusing on Maus allows us to see a political and cultural moment in the US in pretty clear terms. There is a movement on the part of the far right, not just to target literature, which is, after all, not a new phenomenon. What we are seeing in the recent and intensifying efforts to ban books is deeply connected to legal and other efforts to restrict how sensitive subjects should be addressed in school curricula, especially the subjects of race, history, and sexual identity. Even prize-winning works that have been widely acknowledged as literarily and culturally important have been pulled from the shelves of school and public libraries. So yes, as you listen to us, think about the books that you've read, which have presented maybe not even banned literature, but which have presented a wholly different worldview than your own, or challenged you to rethink something important. Maus in McMinn County, Tennessee. In January 2022, Maus appeared on the agenda of a school board meeting in McMinn County, Tennessee. The board voted to remove Maus from public school curriculum. And the reason, as we had suggested, profanity, nudity, violence, and suicide. There is a depiction of a naked female mouse, and Grace, I'm glad you've fleshed out that element of the story because it's associated with the suicide of the mother. I had never once considered, in the many times I've taught this, that this would be ever considered a sexualized image. Quite the contrary. And Spiegelman has spoken about this, that there's more to it than profanity or the nudity of a cartoon mouse. The school board apparently is uncomfortable with the Holocaust and the profound questions it raises about genocide and memory, family, and survival. The minutes of that meeting, which are available online, it's always good for us to consult primary source material, not listen to a talking head on television or talking heads here on stage, but consult the primary source material yourself, and you can see that none of the board members had read Maus. They had had it called to their attention with page numbers flagged, and they hadn't absorbed and digested the literature. One member of the meeting noted that the typical process for handling complaints over curricula had been bypassed. Nevertheless, the board voted unanimously to remove the book and directed teachers to find a suitable replacement. Board member Tony Allman noted that Maus described people being hanged and children being killed. In fact, the younger brother, or perhaps it's the older brother, Rishu in Maus, was a child victim during the Holocaust. He didn't survive, but the memory of that dead child hangs over the family quite uncomfortably. The board member said, why does the educational system promote this kind of stuff? It's not wise or healthy. And that really misapprehends the purpose of why Holocaust curriculum would be in our schools or in your college classrooms. And I have to say that that comment reminded me of a date that I was on in between my first marriage, which ended, and my now second and last permanent marriage. I was on a date. I was, 42 years old. And man, it was uncomfortable because I knew it wasn't going to go anywhere. Not only because the woman said, you know, I'm not really into the Holocaust. And I'm there with my coffee. I'm thinking, I'm not into mass murder either. I'm not into the violent suppression of human rights and everything that goes with it. So yeah, that one didn't go anywhere, but fortunately I met Nancy, my wife, and everything turned out all right. Maus is one of several hundred books being challenged according to the American Library Association, and the movement to ban books has focused largely on voices from marginalized communities, race, sexuality, and history. This, I would submit to you, has to do with upholding white heterosexual Christian nationalism, which privileges some over others. It suppresses or erases the narratives of marginalized voices, and this is coming at the same time with a lot of other elements in our society that we need to take a look at. Oklahoma has a new state law limiting public school lessons or materials that lead students to, quote, feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress, end quote, because of their race or gender. And as a teacher, I don't know what to do with that. If something might make you feel uncomfortable, I shouldn't teach it. We shouldn't expose our students to that. I'll leave that an open question. Back to my key word of a moment ago, Gleichschaltung. Toward the goal of Nazifying the nation, on May 10th, 1933, in towns all across Germany, university students they burned some 25,000 books deemed to be un-German. It was a shocking display of barbarism, with books being pillaged from public and university libraries. Among the authors were Albert Einstein, Sigmund Freud, Bertolt Brecht, Helen Keller, and Ernest Hemingway. In many cases, the books were by Jewish, liberal, and left-leaning writers. Now, we are not Nazi Germany, but are we so far away from this? You saw a clip a moment ago. It was kind of a disembodied clip without much context, but in our recent, historical moment, we've seen some voices from the fringe argue in favor of burning books. November 2021, books were banned by the school board of Spotsylvania County in Northern Virginia. 2 members of the board went so far as to recommend that books be burned. In the aftermath of that incident, one of the members said, I didn't really mean it. I was caught up in the heat of the moment. But the other board member not only did not walk back his remarks, he became president of the school board. Again, Spotsylvania County in Northern Virginia. In April of this year, the Republican-led Tennessee House State Legislature passed a bill that requires public school librarians to submit to the state a list of book titles for approval. One of the GOP lawmakers opined that offending books should be burned. So we're not necessarily so far away. What we're seeing is a radical fringe, a movement that bears little resemblance to the principles that were once the standards of the Republican Party. When this event began, Democracy Days 22 years ago, the most recent Republican National Convention, which would have been the 2000 convention, upheld this idea that we are the party of ideas. And its winning candidate in the presidential election, George H.W. Bush, this would be George W. Bush, campaigned on a slogan of compassionate conservatism. Those are 2 reference points to suggest we're a long way from that. What this results in is a climate of intimidation. So even when, for instance, the Missouri State Legislature doesn't list books that, these have to be made verboten, what it does is create a climate of intimidation and the threat of criminalization. And it induces librarians and others at school to self-censor. Okay, the state isn't telling me we have to pull Maus, but I better do it anyway, and maybe I'll just teach something that's more palatable. In this particular subject field, for instance, that would be, for instance, the The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, which presents a really much softer, more palatable Holocaust narrative. There's some talk in this field about the pajamification of Holocaust studies. Not a good thing. So it might lead people like me, especially at the high school and middle school level, to teach something that just, I know this won't get objected to. It's easier on everybody that way. So it's about intimidation. It's about incipient fascism. It's about creating and perpetuating narratives that we, this us versus them, and they are described in increasingly apocalyptic terms. So I would argue that this whole book banning is connected to a fascist fringe movement in this country, and it's not just about literature. In the same way that 60 years ago, it was not just about whether black people should be able to have water fountains that were integrated with the rest of society. It's not just about water fountains and swimming pools from 2 generations ago, and today I would argue that it's not just about what books should be included in school public libraries. I'm going to restrict my remarks to that and turn it over.
All right, so I'd like to build on what's already been shared here and talk a little bit about really a great segue from what Michael was just mentioning, what we could possibly lose with this kind of banning situation on top of the obvious oppressive scenario and the fact that we're putting librarians and teachers in a very vulnerable spot being held accountable for this. I teach The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. Some folks here read The Bluest Eye? Yeah, like to see that. Just last semester, you may have heard of the Wentzville school system, among many others, this is not particularly unusual for this text, did ban the book. That ended up getting overturned. But I also should mention we're in Banned Book Week, by the way. I'll mention more of that at the end, but there are ongoing activities around the country to rally if you feel like getting out there and doing something about this, and reading, which is kind of the best activism you can do in this category. Bluest Eye has been on the ALA, the American Library Association's list of the top 10 sort of troublemaker banned books for 2021. And frankly, The Bluest Eye is a sweetheart of that list. It's not a newcomer. It's from 1973, I'm fairly certain, and it has gotten into trouble many times before, as its wonderful author, Toni Morrison, has for other pieces as well. So I wanted to talk about, since some of you are familiar with the book, which makes me so happy, what we're standing to lose on top of these greater political concerns we've mentioned here is the power of the story. So let's back up. As an English teacher, I have to say, I think storytelling is one of the most innately human qualities that we have and our need to tell our story, to hear other stories, to connect those. I always think of the example of constellations, right? You look at the night sky and you know, of course, if you're interested in mythology, a great set of storytelling that spans many cultures and generations, that humans have sought to make meaning and see images in those stars. And I think that's a great analogy for what we do every day of our life. Like we see a series of objective or factual things, but we internalize them and make meaning of them in a very unique way, always inspired by our own unique context, right? And this is critical to our development as people. It makes us interesting, creative, original. It's our lifeblood in a way. And for some of my students here, I know you've recently listened to the Danger of the Single Story, the TED Talk from famous Nigerian writer Adichie, and she talks about what is to be lost when we don't hear more stories that connect to ourselves, when we're only given certain limited subjecthoods. So going back to The Bluest Eye, you know, the reason that The Bluest Eye usually gets flagged, and I will not shy away from the fact that Toni Morrison writes very hefty stuff. There is no debate about that here. That's why we love her, but she makes you work. There is not a text of hers that isn't filled with that, and that is her ongoing project among many. She's no longer with us, but her works continue to do this. And in The Bluest Eye, incest in particular is central to the story. You learn this on the opening page. I'm not giving away any spoilers. But you have a young black girl who will ultimately be carrying the child of her father. You have sexual abuse. These things obviously are heavy topics. I'm not here to debate that. But in addition to that, if you think about in the story, you have a young girl who, as a Black female child, is struggling to see her own beauty as a person. And we see regularly that her ugliness, and I do not mean just of an aesthetic value, although that's included, but her core being regularly thrown in her face. She does have the opportunity to develop, as we all should, to see the beauty in our unique selves. There are no images, there is no guidance, there are no role models to that, and all the adults around her seemingly have internalized very unhealthy ideas about Blackness and poverty and where they live, to the point where she has really no options. And in particular, Shirley Temple, that's a bit of a dated reference, I realize at this point, but hopefully you know the image of the little white girl with the reddish, she ends up becoming an ambassador, right? Her little curls, dancing around, being this image of adorable, loquacious, white femininity in a child. And that is who our character, Pecola Breedlove, and her friends are rather obsessed with. They want access to that beauty. That is relevant to them. And without her story, we see what happens. There is no center in that text for her to turn to. Where in the world, as a young Black girl in that moment, to find something that validates her beauty in her own community, in movie pictures, the things she loves? So literally the story does a very brave thing in recounting her unraveling. That is a bit of a spoiler. But by the end of the text, right, if you remember, her internal dialogue, her sense of self, I mean, we're faced with clear mental illness. I mean, she has lost her center, and how could she not? So what I'm saying is, a bit ironically, this book seeks to provide a voice to that experience, to show that omission and try to correct that omission. But by beginning that book, we're only replicating the very issues that it sought to give voice to and to correct. And that's not an unusual circumstance, right? That's really at the core of all of these. I think it speaks a lot to our national issue with dealing with trauma, that we want to not talk about things because we, for some reason, feel that that is the surest way to getting rid of them. And there's just a whole lot of data. I'm no social scientist, but I even know there's a lot of data disproving that. It just intuitively feels wrong, too. And stories are such a critical part of breaking that silence. And when we're looking at banning books that specifically target people of color and non-cis, gendered representation, LGBTQ types of sexuality that just don't fit that very narrow heteronormative mold, and marking that as pornographic, as I mentioned briefly in the video, like what does that do to anyone of that population who identifies that way? We're literally saying that's a kind of discursive violence, we would say in English in a fancy way, but that is a psychological violence too. If your story is being said it's not valid, it's wrong, it's pornographic, it shouldn't be on shelves, young children shouldn't be exposed to it. And I'm not suggesting young children read The Bluest Eye, I will clarify that. But that's where I get very impassioned about this, and hope that you do too. I mean, really, my book, my shirt here says my deepest message, read banned books. I think LeVar Burton's one of his recent tweets, and I am, Reading Rainbow alum, like read the banned books. That's where you find the good stuff. And if you're interested in that, following up, hashtag banned books, it's going on right now. I think it's perfect that Grace timed this. So we're in the midst of it. But activities, read-ins, nationally, we have some awesome librarians here on campus, I'm sure, who are plugged into that. But that's the core of it here. Remember, banning books, as far as I can tell, has always been about control and never about freedom. And that makes it troubling to me from the very get-go. So, don't know if you wanted to get questions or comments, Grace, or if any of my other colleagues wanted to.
Is this working? Can you guys hear me? Now you can. I left my phone up here, so I'm going to grab it real quick.
Pick up at that idea of control as well. Just a short quote I wanted to share with you. In 1911, Percival Chubb founded the League for Improvement of the Children's Comic Supplement. Early comics were essentially advertisements or colorful ways to sell advertisements. Newspapers would drop them in. Kids would spend Sunday morning or Sunday afternoon just spread out looking at their comics. But according to Percival Chubb, the child of the comic supplement is the quote-unquote smart kid. The absolute abomination of American life is the smart kid. We must get rid of him. Uncles and aunts, fathers and mothers are alike made clowns in every comic supplement in order to control and make attractive to the American youth this ideal of the smart kid. And smart here isn't used as intelligent, but rather as one who talks back, one who thinks for themselves, one who challenges or questions authority. And suggesting that books are an avenue to challenging traditional thought or conservative or repressive thought is spot on. It is. And in fact, in 1969 ruling, Tinker v. Des Moines, the Supreme Court said, such access prepares students for active and effective participation in the pluralistic, often contentious society in which they will soon be adult members. This is the whole point of education, public education. We are a diverse society. We need to be exposed to diverse ideas. But control often suggests that, maybe that's not a great one.
So we still have about 20 minutes left, and I wanted to give a chance to everybody to ask a question if you have one. But I just wanted to mention this to the panel, or ask you guys, put this question. One of the questions I came across in researching this is, we found that the banned books are now like selling, like it has the opposite effect of like prohibiting people from reading the books, that now they're like selling wildly. Like for a while I tried to get a copy of Mouse and it was sold out everywhere. So I want to, pointing that out, like people can just buy books if they want them. Why should we care about banned books? I have an answer, but I want to know what you guys have to say about it.
Could I jump in and just say, if you would like, take a look, just do a keyword search for Brooklyn Public Library and QR code. You will get a QR code that will permit you to get an ebook, including banned books, through the Brooklyn Public Library. I wanted to include that QR code in the Democracy Days program, and it didn't make it in there, but it's widely available. Brooklyn Public Library will give you access, even though we're not in Brooklyn. So just kind of piggybacking on the idea.
So if you want to read it, you don't have, you can get it through the Brooklyn Public Library.
That's correct.
What you're referring to, I'm familiar with as the Streisand effect, which actually comes from South Park, an animated television show in which Barbara Streisand is made out to be a monstrous Mechagodzilla, and she wanted the episode banned, and then more people found out about it. And in fact, Art Spiegelman references this about Mouse. He says of the Tennessee School Board that they should have checked with their book banning predecessor, Russian President Vladimir Putin. He made the Russian edition of Mouse illegal in 2015, and with good intentions, the idea of banning swastikas. And the small publishers sold out immediately and had to reprint repeatedly. But to answer your question, yes, everything is essentially available online. I do still think it's a question of equity and access, though. I mean, yeah, the Brooklyn Public Library has made this available, but if I don't have a smartphone, if I don't have internet access, that's not available to me, versus maybe my public library or my school library where I'm legally required to be. These books should be available to students.
I would add too, I really do enjoy the rogue rebound of these. Like I get like, yeah, go out and buy those banned books. Like anytime buying books and reading can be seen, as I said earlier, as a radical revolutionary act, which it is, I get very excited about. But I don't want to get too like romanticize, overlook the fact that we are having these political measures taken to stifle, to muzzle powerful voices. And frankly, with the slippage we've seen lately, like with Roe v. Wade, like I feel like instead of us just sort of thinking, aha, it's just these silly guys, like when we saw them looking at Anti-Racist Baby and finding that, which I read to my toddler, as just overwhelming. Like, there is a concern, right, for an oligarchy or those in power. I mean, the things that Michael has brought up so powerfully. I feel like we have to be very sober-minded about that as well.
Yeah, and one thing I think that is really important, particularly for LGBTQ kids, this is their only access to find out that information. It's maybe not safe to buy those books and bring them into their home. It's, they have to do it. Like the library is access to that freedom to learn. So just throwing that out there. Yes, buy banned books, but also there's more you can do. Now, I want to point out that tomorrow at 10 a.m., the librarians and you have someone from Teresa, I'm just going to ask you, you have someone from the Missouri, the ACLU is talking. I'm going to give you the microphone.
Yeah, we'll have, let's see, we'll have the head of the St. Charles City County Library District, a attorney from the ACLU who's working currently on book bans in Missouri, specifically Wentzville. And then 2 other librarians that are kind of children's librarians. I will say I had a hard time getting school librarians to participate because they are fearful because of the new law, so.
But they're going to specifically talk about what you can do now to push back on these book bans and how you can get involved. So I didn't want to say too much about it, but I think that's really important. It's already planned in the program. These sessions really go well hand in hand. So if you get a chance to, if you can attend tomorrow at 10, you can also go onto the website and watch the streaming, or you can watch the recording of it after. So it is a really good opportunity. But one of the big things, something to consider is running for your local school board. Getting involved in a local group of parents, concerned parents that are pushing back. You don't necessarily have to have a student in the school district. You can be a student from the school district, right? And care about the curriculum and what students have available. It is a local issue that we can really get involved in. It's also a national issue. So now I wanted to open it up to you guys. Does anybody have any questions for the panelists?
And I did, by the way, ask for people possibly to speak to their own experience of banned books. So if you would like to speak to that or ask a question, please feel free.
Okay,
Thank you.
so I'm going to come here and then I'm going to come back to you in the back in the red shirt.
Thank you. I recently had a conversation with colleagues, actually in regards to abortion, about our biggest group of population being the baby boomers. And I was kind of wondering if, in regards to the book bans, are we going to see a shift in this culture, like she said, culture war and moral panic, kind of when that population goes out? I don't mean to generalize the generations, but we were discussing, are we going to see that shift in regards to abortion once and topics like LGBTQ and stuff like that? Do you think we are going to see another shift when we have not such a huge population kind of in control?
I think that's a great question, and kind of how you ended that question too, a large group that's not in control. And to Grace's earlier suggestion of running for your local school board or encouraging your parents or someone, I think perhaps part of the reason we see that is we have a disproportionate amount of baby boomers still in political control. The American Library Association did a survey earlier this year and found that the majority of voters, 71%, oppose bans. And even so, the majority of parents, 61% oppose bans. So to Michael's earlier point, this is a fringe group who remains in power or seeks to hold power that is stirring up trouble or causing the controversy. I think, we could only hope for more activism in the youth,
All right, so I have a sequence of questions to ask, if that's cool.
Sure.
So, do you think that individuals under the age of 16 are the most confused? Not confused, but they're just getting an understanding of life. Would you agree to that?
Sure.
So
a lot of ideas are still being formed at that age. Yes.
So then don't you think that since they're at a critical age and a critical like stage of their life, shouldn't we just stick to just like teaching the fundamentals, like learning, like just for example, like 1 + 1 = 2, the government, like all that stuff, learning about those things instead of like pushing, or not, maybe not pushing, but just sticking to like the strict things. So do you think we should stick to the strict things when they're like under the ages of 16, then go into like other confusing, I guess, topics?
Well, my question would just be what we would count as the sort of standard. That's the part that gets a bit complicated, because that is somewhat arbitrarily and politically chosen too, saying like a gentler version of the Holocaust, which was a historical reality. I mean, I appreciate your statement. I do think these things need to be provided like discernment on an individual basis, perhaps. But I think we have to be careful trusting that there's a neat, neutral, apolitical standard to lean on. What would y'all like to say something further to that?
I would just say that the manner in which things are taught means a lot. So for instance, Mouse in McMinn County, Tennessee, it wasn't just thrown in their laps, read this, possibly very disturbing story. It was the culmination of, I think, an 8-week unit. Check me on that, I'd have to check. But there was a whole pedagogy and a process and a curriculum that led people up to that. And that's what I also found with my daughter in the 5th grade. She wouldn't like me telling you this, but she was still going to bed in the 5th grade with a stuffed animal, all right? So I'm not in any push to have her into the Holocaust, but what I found was a very cogent, age-appropriate way with young adult novels to expose students to the Holocaust. So I would look at the context before I try to say one thing or another in terms of what's appropriate for students under 16. It can be, in terms of the Holocaust, for instance, I think it can be taught well, even to middle school students.
Okay. And then when it comes to the banned books and like those things, like I understand the point when it comes to like what you guys are saying, like the putting your arm around one's shoulder, like that. I feel like that was taken out of proportion. But when it comes to things like actual like pornography and just those type of topics, shouldn't that be restricted to those people that are under the age of 16 or even 18?
That's a fair question, and I would follow that up maybe with another question: is sex education inherently pornographic? As a person, I grew up, sexually curious, and I probably encountered those questions before they were laid out in front of me. In all things moderation, or only the Sith deal in absolutes, I'd say a ban, one way, or suggesting that all these things be taught regardless of age and content. Either one of those is wrong. To Michael's point, nuance is very important here, which again, in my mind, speaks to the danger of scripts, of prompts, of groups that are pushing an agenda rather than having that agenda come from a place of actual inquiry or concern, but rather it's, even to Rachel's point, about exercising control over what people should be curious about or should think about. Certainly there may be some danger in exposing children to dangerous ideas, but also there might be, an opportunity for redemption.
Okay, we had some questions over here.
Hi, I came a little late. I have a statement and a question. So my statement is that I think to his question as far as 16-year-olds being exposed and how can you do that, I think that comes down to what that child may have already been exposed to. And so I myself, I'm 44, and I grew up in a very rural area in Wright City. I also was the one who joined the ACLU lawsuit for Wentzville to return the bluest eye proudly. And I, at 11, was exposed to rape. I think that is why it hit me so hard for it to be equated with rape, because it was molestation, which I also was exposed to. Having access to material that gave a voice to me as a black girl in a very rural area was important. And so the thought of those materials being removed meant that you didn't want to see me or someone who may experience what I have experienced. I think that giving information I have 4 children, and so giving information to children in an age-appropriate way is important, but all kids are going to be exposed to certain things. I was exposed to it. And so for me to have a book or material, because back then we didn't talk about this type of stuff. You were basically said to be quiet, move on, don't worry about it. And so giving any material, a book, to kind of explain the feelings and thoughts that I had that I could not explain, gave voice to my experience. It gave voice to a different perspective. You know what I mean? So for me, it's important for us not to ban books just because it makes us uncomfortable. You know, because it's up to the reader. I didn't interpret that book and see what others saw. I can appreciate what they saw, but at the same time, I can tell you, you don't get to make that decision for me. Yeah. And you don't get to choose what my version of that book is, or any book for that matter. But I do think it is important for us to learn how to advocate for ourselves, especially students. I think it is important for us to learn what our rights are, what we can, and to not allow these certain things to take the lead, because they will continue. For me, I just, when I heard about what Wentzville was doing, it hit me different, because I was in a school where I was not seen. And to me, that was another act of not being seen for somebody else. And I was unwilling to not do anything. And so that's what I decided to, and I'm proud of it. And I hope that more people advocate for themselves, whatever their passions are, but advocate for themselves in that way. And it's only the beginning, unfortunately, but hopefully this generation will stand up and do what they need to do.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
I'll give a little bit different perspective as well as what a lot of these books do. I grew up in St. Charles, but when I moved to Arizona to teach, I realized that I was teaching a population of students that I knew nothing about. So along with some amazing support staff in my room, you know, they shared some different books with me to read, to just get an understanding, and that kind of blossomed my view, because I do have a child with a disability. I taught students with disabilities, so I was already used to being an advocate, but I knew that my calling was even more so. So to just continue to advocate for people that may struggle with their voice, may not have as big of a voice no matter where they are and where they live. So we moved back here, and so that's kind of what we're doing now. You know, there's policies in schools that if parents don't want their children to view certain content, or they're young adults, they're 16-year-olds that are driving, they're 18-year-olds that can vote now but are still in high school, they can still, you know, there's still policies in place, you know. We're working on reviewing some of those, but, and it also gives me a perspective of what my students were going through and what my own children are and will go through. That's incredibly important, because again, we view things from very different lenses, all of us, but it doesn't have to remain stagnant and remain there. So just want to share that. And all of you guys are our future. There's parents out there that are fighting against this. Come to school board meetings, we're there. So sorry to plug that.
I like it, thank you. It's about 12:40, so we probably have time for like one more question, I'm thinking. And you guys were looking like you really wanted to talk, so do you want to fight it out? I saw you first, so if you want to ask.
I got it. What is, you said earlier about if you want us to talk about what we learned from banned books, like what good we learned, and know that last year when I was a senior in high school, I read a book called The Glass Castle, and it was a book about, I guess, this author, the narrator Jeanette Walls, and her very dysfunctional family living in poverty, and it just opened my eyes to the hardships of poverty, like what school is like and how getting food is like. And I just feel like if you can look past all the bad stuff about the book, there's a lot to learn from it. And I feel like that book is an example of why we shouldn't just ban books just because of at a glance what's, just from at a glance about the problems with it. So that's what I wanted to say really quick.
Thank you.
No, it's okay. Awesome. Did you have a banned book story? Oh, okay.
So I know earlier it was brought up like fundamentals, trying to stick with that, but everyone's fundamentals are different. I grew up queer. I knew from the age of 12 that I liked men and women, but I didn't know what that meant. So I went home one night and Googled, what does that mean? Which is what I found out what bisexuality was. So I was like, I didn't know what that was until I went and I searched. I know where I grew up, there are some people who most likely didn't know what a black person was until they saw them at the age of 5 in a public school. Our fundamentals are all very different from one another. And in my opinion, I think they should all be broad. By the time we're 16, we are developed enough to be able to understand what a different religion is and not know that we follow it. Like, we should know that we don't believe in that, but we can still understand it. So I feel like banning books creates a barrier and just has more control over us, and I don't like that.
Agreed. Thank you.
Good point.
Okay, well, I think we'll go ahead and end there, but thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you for all your good questions. Please attend more Democracy Day presentations. Attend that banned book tomorrow if you can. We also have a special speaker that's talking about the Constitution and the insurrection, what January 6th means for us as a country. So that's tomorrow at 11:30, Michael, is that right? 11:30?
That's right.
Okay, that's going to be great.
How are you doing?